All right, welcome to our presentation on gifted and talented students. Our overview is that in many settings, there are students with special intellectual abilities that the question is, can it be more of a disability or a gift? You'll notice that most of our educational systems are based upon the vast majority and then tailoring those assets to those that either are in the middle or fall below the curve. And so what we're looking at is the students that are on the high end of the curve, with these special needs being identified as gifted students, that there are not the resources that are available for those students.
Okay, for the timeline of giftedness, we have Sir Francis Galton in the 1800s published some of the first work on human intelligence. Then in 1904, Binet and Simon developed the first IQ test, known as the Simon Binet IQ test. Then in 1916, Louis Terman, who's recognized as the father of gifted education, he revised the Binet Simon and published the Stanford Binet, which was adapted from the original test that was in French and also included new terms using two scales instead of one to provide a more accurate score. He was also the first researcher to do a longitudinal study of gifted students and found that they were reportedly stronger physically, emotionally, and academically than their peers. In 1929, Dr. Maria Montessori founded the Association Montessori Internazionale. The Montessori education system was not created with gifted children in mind, but has consistently demonstrated to be an excellent fit when instructing gifted children. Then in United States, in 1988, Jacob Javits Gifted and Talented Student Education Act was passed without providing extra funds. Those funds were provided in 2001 for the Javits program, and then in 2011, all funds granted in 2001 were eliminated. So, what is gifted and talented? The definition is very broad and changes even inside the United States, changes from one state to another. But basically, the definition is students that have an advanced ability in one or more areas compared to peers of comparable age, environment, and experience. In the United States, not every state has a mandated definition of giftedness. That's why it varies from one state to another. And even being gifted is not recognized by the DSM 5, neither by IDEA.
So there are six kind of traditional types of gifted learners. The first type is the successful type. This is about 90% of the gifted students. These are the ones that are most likely to be identified for gifted programs. These students do not exhibit behavior problems. They're eager to seek approval. But this is kind of something interesting about those students is that they know how to work the system so that they have to do as little as possible. The second type is a challenging student, and these students that are divergently gifted with high levels of creativity. So they can be more challenging in the classroom, they may have more negative self concept. They usually feel frustrated with education and are at risk of dropping out to lead to either like using drugs or delinquent behaviors. Type three is the underground student. These are students that try to hide their talents and avoid pressure. They really want to fit in with the group. They're generally females, insecure, and anxious. Type 4 is dropouts. These students are usually angry and resentful because the system hasn't met their needs yet. These are students that tend to be identified later on, and so they may act depressed or defensive during their educational career, and counseling may be needed to help those students. The fifth type is a double labeled student. These are students that may also have other physical or emotional disabilities that hides their giftedness. So their other disability is noted first, not necessarily recognizing their giftedness. Type 6 is the autonomous learner, and these are students, much like the first students, they will be successful, they're eager to learn, but they, unlike the first group, are working the system so that they can create new opportunities and therefore more likely to become successful. Your type 1 and your type 6 students are the most easily recognized, and types 2 through 5 are often not identified or misdiagnosed.
Giftedness is recognized as a category in a number of states that funds programs for talented or gifted students, but ultimately it's up to the state's administration to decide whether or not to grant funds to gifted students. Here's a map with the states with difference in education about giftedness. The green states, such as New Mexico, Texas, Louisiana, are states that have mandate and have funding for giftedness programs. Orange states like New York State, where we are, have definition for gifted but no mandate, either in identification or not funding at all.
So, part of bringing up the state comparison is that I moved to New York last year from Texas. And in Texas, they do offer gifted and talented programs. These programs are mandated. Where it says LEA is your local education agency that typically refers to the school districts. So, the school districts are determining the programs and the criteria for placement. Because these programs are mandated, there's also identification of these students and they can track how many students. So 8% of Texas population was identified. So that's 5.5 million students, 8% of them are identified. Because these programs are mandated, there is state funding, and that is a critical point. So in New York, there are no mandates for gifted education. So when you think of what would potentially 8% of our, say, 2.5 million student population be, those students are not being identified. Here, the LEA can determine programs. So New York City has programs, but the rest of New York State does not really offer programs in public education. Therefore, there's also no data that's collected and there's no funding. So it just kind of all stops right there. So this is kind of looking at where is New York compared to some of the other states and opportunities for students.
There's some attention areas to work when talking about giftedness. The first one is program funding. The first you need is money to those programs. Then once you have the money, the programming, the classroom, the enrichment for gifted needs, uh, the awareness that being gifted may not be obvious depending on the type of gift that a child has. So also on recognizing those children. Uh, students have Students that are gifted can have other disabilities, and the giftedness can be masked by their disabilities. So not just the students but the teachers also needs support in addressing it. And also it's needed to change the mindset that bridging the gap for underperformers is just the focus of the teacher, when we as teachers should think not just in the ones that are on the bottom but the ones that are on the top of a classroom, not to get bored. So how to recognize a gifted child? First, gifted children are curious and ask a lot of questions about the world around them and may ask detailed questions to satisfy their thirst for knowledge. This curiosity goes beyond simple interest in the topic and can extend to aspects that are seemingly outside of the scope of the lesson. In a school setting, the child may not be satisfied with only learning what is necessary in order to do well on an exam or complete an assignment. At home, there might be not always be time or the background knowledge required to provide answers. While this can be frustrating for teachers, parents, and children alike, it's important to avoid discouraging a child from asking questions, as this can be demotivating and shut down future communication attempts. Gifted students take their own approach to assignments, whereas bright students looks to please the teacher and finish assignments the way the teacher asked them to do it. Gifted children often have their own way of going about things. This can be due to a desire to focus on only one aspect of a topic of a perceived or a perceived lack of challenge in the task itself. For example, in a school, let's say they may only partially answer the question or go off completely on a tangent. In a mathematics setting, a child may take an alternative route to prove a problem solving task than it which was required by the question. Now, in both situations, it's important for teachers to be tolerant and avoid reprimanding or penalizing the child for not following directions, especially if it's a gifted child. Gifted children usually have a large vocabulary and prefer adult conversation. This is because they often understand and use more words than their peers, including abstract and figurative language. They might be due to reading habits and exposure to more advanced texts. It can also be thanks to a heightened sensitivity to syntax and the ability to guess the meaning of new words encountered just in context. It might also be easier for some of these kids to remember words as they require less repetition in order to acquire language. Some gifted children feel more at ease communicating with adults due to their advanced language skill.
Gifted students often are original thinkers. They're able to access abstract reasoning and bring ideas together from all sorts of different areas. These students can have a wild imagination and develop very sophisticated stories or songs or plays. So, when you're seeing their work, you may see some complex language, as was stated in one of the reasons above. And also, they may have an advanced appreciation for humor. Um, Next, children who are gifted can appear to be cognitively advanced. These are students who maybe taught themselves how to read and write before they went to school. They could have advanced reasoning skills and a good memory. When you think about a traditional student, most times in the classroom they need to be exposed to material 8 to 15 times, where a gifted student may only need to hear that material one or two times and they are able to process that information. So these are students then that can become bored in class because the lessons start to seem repetitive. They may start to tune out the teacher. They may start to exhibit some behavior problems because of their boredom. Next, students from a very young age may seem alert and tuned into their environment and create a sensitivity about that. They might have acute cognitive concentration skills and can become very focused on a certain kind of task. So, for these types of students, you want to think about engaging them with new stimuli so that you're able to grow and they can develop cognitively. It's important to ensure that cognitive children receive adequate stimulation, in particular, looking into having correct classroom placements. Lastly, these children, gifted children, often have quite strong feelings. They can be very opinionated about topics, especially things that they consider are important to them. They may be more aware of others' opinions and feelings of other people. They can also be quite emotional. Because these students can be very aware and self aware, it can cause them to be introverts because they don't feel like they fit in. This is one of the reasons why, as parents, they often choose to move these students into other gifted and talented programs so that they can be with like individuals.
Some characteristics of gifted students that you as teacher can see in a classroom. They are often more talkative than the rest of their peers and also more energetic. They apparently are inattentive or easily distracted. That can be confused with ADHD syndrome kids, but the gifted children, on unlike the ADHD, they mostly always gonna answer correctly your questions. Also, they have a heightened sense of curiosity, so they might ask you a question that seems outlandish and unrelated to the classroom. And they have advanced thinking and comprehension than their peers. That's why they can jump from point A to point D without stopping in point B and C. They have an unusually high sense of humor. They can be even very humorous about their peers. These can lead to student frustration at the pace of the lesson that the teacher is following for the rest of the class. That boredom can lead to behavior problems. So, regular learning environment is not appropriate for children who are far out on the high end of intelligence continuum precisely because of that. Common misconceptions about gifted children is that gifted students will be okay in a regular classroom. No, they will not be okay. Teachers can use gifted students as role models and they can inspire other students. Gifted students are not often role models at all. A gifted students will have good grades, not necessarily. Actually, most of them are failing in several classes. Giving a gifted student more work is how teachers can address their needs. That can be debatable. More work doesn't need doesn't mean that the child is going to learn more or you're going to fulfill their need to learn. Gifted students are gifted in all areas, not at all. They can be gifted in math and they can be behind in history or reading. Gifted students can read a book if they finish their work early. That is not a good solution. That can lead to boredom and to uh, issues.
So, in trying to assess students that would be considered gifted, again, remember New York State does not have that standardized ability. You can use standardized tests like your ACT and your SAT. I'm not going to focus as much on those because those are tests for everybody. But I'm going to go into more of the ability tests. Again, coming from Texas, our students every year took the COGAT test. It's a cognitive ability test. It's a reasoning test. It tests how children reason to come to the answers. It's not a standard 2 + 2 = 4. It's a more involved process to see how a student reasons and comes to that answer. So when you're looking at a COGAT score, students that are identified as gifted need to score 99% or higher. Most of us are familiar with IQ tests. We've heard that before. Those tests have a range of scores from mildly gifted up to exceptionally gifted. It's important when you look at the IQ scores that these deviation marks, it's not just that, oh, you scored 5 points more than another student, that the deviation is almost double or triple between um, these demarcations for students. So when you're looking at scores, mildly gifted of about 115 might be more of your high achievers that are in the classroom. But when you start to get over an IQ of 130, where you're moderately gifted into exceptionally gifted, these are the students that we're primarily speaking about here that are falling out from the system as there's nothing in place right now to identify them in New York.
So, tips for teaching gifted learners. First, it's a good idea to use tiered assignments. Generate a mid-level assignment, add extension for pros and cons, two possible choices, and basically argue against your own point of view as a teacher. Given the opportunity to work at their own pace within the unit that you're giving unto them, offering extension projects related to that unit. Giving them the opportunity to do open-ended or self-directed assignments so they can self-teach themselves. Compact the unit. Give them the five hardest problem in the unit. If they know those, they already met the expectation, so you can move to project-based learning in which they can use real-world applications of the unit's knowledge. And lastly, pair gifted students. Even if they are not in the same classroom, you should pair them to offer them the opportunity to challenge each other.
These are our references if you are interested in any of the information that we shared in our presentation. And then lastly, our discussion questions. Our first question is, what are 3 characteristics that would lead you to think that you have a gifted student in your classroom and why? Our second question is, how would you as a teacher offer enrichment to gifted students when there are not programs available? And the last question goes back to the title of our presentation. Is being gifted a disability or not? And explain why. Thank you very much.